Thanks, Ellie, and thanks, Wendy, for that introduction. But what Wendy forgot is that yesterday I found out that I'm a great-grandfather. That is, I got a picture of my daughter holding her granddaughter. Now, I mean, many of you in this room, that'll be a shocking idea. It's just the concept that your daughter has a granddaughter is really kind of, anyway, so yes, it's a big day. You see here many of my co-authors. Some of them you have already heard about. I have a great many co-authors, as you can see. I've worked together. I've been working since for about the last 2 decades on this question, and at the Santa Fe Institute, Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder and I put together a group in 2006, which has continued on basically with a whole series of mostly quantitative studies of various topics. It involves always large groups of people from many disciplines, usually using some quantitative technique or model to look at cross-cultural studies, allowing comparative insights that typically are not possible in anthropology or archaeology without the use of those models or techniques. Yes, that's a picture of my co-authors, and the Santa Fe Institute is a marvelous place. There are many people in the room from SFI here to do this work. And there's a picture of Suresh, Jungkyu Choi, Rajiv Sethi, and me. That was some time ago. That was actually still talking about exactly this project. Now, in the meantime, a series of really wonderful contributions have been made to this literature. And I mentioned two. You've heard about one already. The book on the right is by Dow and Reed, economists. The two books are very, very different. I'm so sorry that David Graeber can't be with us to discuss these issues. As you know, he's the co-author with David Wengrow of that book, but he passed away some years ago. Now, I'm connected to the book in a way that I didn't know, having been working on this question for a long time. Do you see the subtitle of the first chapter? Why this book is not about the origins of inequality. So maybe David and I will have something to talk about in the course of the day, and I'm quite sure we will, because what I take to be my question is what they took to be a non-question. I'll try to have a go at explaining that, and of course David will as well. I reviewed both of these works. They're available online. The story I'm going to tell is really sort of complicated. It's deep, and I don't expect to be able to tell you the whole thing. So let me give you first just the story as a kind of summary. What is to be explained is the origin of enduring economic inequality, and I underline enduring for reasons which will become clear. I want to start with measuring ancient inequality, and I'll spend a bit of time on something which you'll consider terribly nerdy, which is how really do we measure the inequality, and how sure are we of the data, and how do we take account systematically of our uncertainty when we do statistical tests. I'll then, borrowing a language sort of Stephen Shannon, where are you, Stephen? He's here somewhere. He referred to a Darwinian archaeology. The model, which I'll describe very briefly, non-technically, is Darwinian in a particular sense. It wants to explain why something endures, not why it happens in the first place. And I'll distinguish between episodic and enduring inequality. I'll then raise a puzzle, which is not why inequality happened, but why it took so long to happen. That is why sustained enduring inequality. Really, I think the really interesting question is why it didn't happen rather shortly after the introduction of farming, rather than much longer after that. And I'll introduce the term aggressive egalitarianism, which is a term of an archaeologist studying the period, and Ian Hodder. I'll use that to explain some of the cultural framework which was maybe responsible for this long period of relatively limited inequality. I'll then, drawing on the work that I've done with Amy and Mattia Focasato, introduce what I call the Neolithic robots, that is the ox-drawn plow, And I'll make a distinction which I'll ask you to think hard about because it will be unfamiliar to some of you. That is between a labor-limited economy, in which labor is the primary scarce factor of production, and a land-limited economy, in which the amount of land is the thing which most importantly determines your well-being. And by land-limited, I mean any kind of material wealth, including ox teams and other means of production. The second hypothesis about the emergence of enduring inequality is a political story, and it's about the archaic proto-state. I've highlighted the term archaic proto-state because it's not a Weberian state for reasons which I will explain when we get to that in the story. Slavery is very important here, and me and my team connect to that in an interesting way, I think. Slavery allows labor itself to become a material form of wealth, which can be inherited just like cattle or land, and therefore it can convert a highly labor-intensive economy into one which looks just like a land-limited economy. I wonder if the story which I'll tell has any bearing on other parts of the world. Amy knows a lot about that because she's been studying recently the Western Hemisphere, but also she has a fantastic paper, along with Mattia and others, on Thailand. I don't know if you have time to do that, but I'll set you up. I'll ask you, please, because I think she has some interesting things to say about that. I won't have much to say about it. But Wendy did ask that we all think about what can we learn from what we have studied here about the future of inequality. And I will spend some time on that. So that's the story. We're going to do all of that in, what do we have left? 50 minutes or 40 minutes? Yeah. Okay, enduring economic inequality. On the vertical axis, you see the Gini coefficient. That's a measure of wealth inequality, ranging from 0 equality to 1. One person has all the wealth. On the y-axis, you have years BC, and each dot is an observation. And the horizontal line up at the top, that's the average of the Gini coefficient from that period of time right up to the year 2000. And interestingly, there's no trend. If we have data going from this period right up to the year 2000, and if you look at those data, there really is no trend. That is, once inequality gets up around 0.7, it just doesn't change, until today. But there's much more that you can learn from this. I just inserted there another horizontal line. That's mean inequality in the first part of the data set there. Now, I separated the data set into the data points for which we're pretty sure that nothing like a proto-state existed, and data points after which some kind of political concentration possibly resembling a proto-state exists. That happens to be between Tepe Gawra, the two levels there, 12 and 11. Now, that's pretty arbitrary, but if you, what you see there is that inequality of the previous period, going back to 20,000 years ago, the data aren't shown, are an average of a Gini coefficient of 0.3. After that, the Gini coefficient goes up to 0.7 and is flat. So it's just like a step function. Now, I just think that's extraordinary. I mean, I don't think something happened between Tepe Gawra at 12 and 11. I mean, something did happen, I do think, but not that caused this. But it's an extraordinary data set. So this is what I mean when I say the origin of enduring economic inequality is something that actually happened. There was something that kept inequality at fairly low levels, and I'll explain, but not uniformly low levels. But when I looked at this graph also, just this morning, I thought, oh, why don't I put a box up there? That rectangle has no observations in it, none. And that rectangle has no observations in it. I mean, you don't need to do statistical tests to figure out that something changed in the data. It doesn't tell you what it is that changed. So keep this in mind. But one last thing here. We have, thanks to the work of Amy and those who've studied Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, we have a bunch of observations on a single place. And these are the observations, which, try not to fall off here, which we have here, Çatalhöyük. And as you can see, reading the levels backwards, if you haven't figured that out from archaeology, there probably is a trend there. That is, the older places were a lot more equal than the younger places. So there was, in that one place, quite a distinct trend towards greater inequality. And then what happened? Çatalhöyük disappeared. The place was abandoned. Does that tell you something about episodic inequality? It didn't last. And we don't know why it didn't last. People probably dispersed. They could because it was on a plain which was relatively unoccupied, and the land wasn't fully farmed at that time because they weren't using plows and they basically were farming relatively small plots. Okay, so this is the kind of thing I think that I'm trying to explain. But now I want to go back. This is the nerdy part. What are we really measuring here? And I'll introduce you to this term, uncertainty laundering. It's like money laundering. It's a bad thing. And it's acting like you're more certain of something than you really are. But let's talk about what is a Gini coefficient. Well, over there on the left, you have a list of the number of cows that people have. This is among the Kipsigis pastoral people in Kenya. This is what Monique has done work on very extensively, and it's part of our team's work. And there you see the distribution of the number of cows. Don't miss the one that has 300 over there on the right. But don't miss the large number that don't have any. And then a lot of people have one and so on. So I say reminder, maybe you all don't know this, but the Gini coefficient is 1/2 of the mean difference between all the pairs of the people in the population relative to the mean income, or mean wealth in this case. And that's described in a paper that Wendy and I did. We did actually of necessity because we had misunderstood the Gini coefficient and assigned problem sets to UCL undergrads, which they couldn't solve because they were not solvable using the algorithm we had given them. So we had to sort of think more deeply about it. The picture just shows 3 people. Those nodes are people. And it asks you to think about the edges. The edges are the differences between them. And that's how you calculate a Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient for those 3 people is 0.5, sort of middling inequality in the data set. Now, we can also describe the wealth distribution by a Lorenz curve. And the Lorenz curve, that is the red line, just shows you the cumulative amount of total wealth owned by the cumulative amount, the poorest part of the population, increasing as you go across the population, which are ordered by their wealth. And that's for the Kipsigis population. That is the herders that Monique studied, and it's basically 0.6. And that's, if you want to see, the red circles tell you which parts of which graph are connected to each other. So the 300 in the one graph, that's right at the top of the Lorenz curve, which is basically steep because one person owns a lot, and so on. But I want to turn to a question which perhaps you hadn't thought of. What would a Lorenz curve for height look like? Now, don't say it's a weird question. Height is a measurement, just like wealth. So there's a total amount of height in this room. And then think about it. I mean, there's some tall guys, like Walter. And there's some other people who are not as tall. So, I mean, just guess. I mean, we know from the Kipsigis because we measured them. And, okay, there are a lot of differences among people. So that's the height among the Kipsigis people. That's the distribution of height. Now you're learning something there. And that's the Lorenz curve. You say, that's not a Lorenz curve. That's just the perfect equality line. No, sorry. That is the Lorenz curve. That little slightly bent curve is the Lorenz curve for height. Now, store that in your mind, because you may think this is just, I'm teaching you nerdy facts about the Gini coefficient. But the fact that height is very equally distributed and cows are very unequally distributed will have an important bearing on what I say towards the end. By the way, this is something that Gini himself studied. Gini's paper, it was not about land. There was some stuff about land, but he had, things like Gini coefficients for heartbeats, Gini coefficients for finger length, and so on. So he was into this, and he commented. He said, wow, there's something going on here because all of these physical measures are much more equal than the material measures. So keep that thought in your head. The second part I want to talk about is measurement is what Gelman called uncertainty laundering. So a long time ago, Arthur Bowley, to the Royal Statistical Society, said that when we present a number, we should tabulate our knowledge or our ignorance as definitely as possible and assign limits to the precision of the estimate so as to allow a measurement of the precision in the aggregate. And he said every number we present, we should do that. And he had basically uniform distributions over some range. That was his idea. Now, the idea that we should really interrogate our data, what do they measure and how unsure we are, was then later promoted by Oscar Morgenstern in his fabulous book, where he talked about specious accuracy and the fact of error. Well, if you're doing archaeology, you're stuck with the fact of error. And you just ought to admit it, measure it, and tell people how unsure you are. Now, what we do is we combine explicit measurement of how unsure we are, Bowley, with what's called randomization inference. And I won't go into that. Some of you have heard about it, some of you haven't. It's a way of dispensing with conventional p-statistics, just using the data that you have at hand. So this is a data point. What? It looks like a distribution, doesn't it? Every site and date we represent as a distribution. That's a probability distribution over the likely values of the Gini coefficient for the Mesopotamian site we referred to there. And so whenever we do any statistical work, we take a draw from that distribution and a draw from all the other distributions, 10,000 of them. And then we calculate our statistics, and that's how we do our comparisons. Now, if you're an archaeologist, you know, the bane of your existence is you're lucky if you can excavate 10 houses or 20 houses or something. The budget runs out or something. But you know there are 500 there. Well, what do you do about that? You know you have small samples, and they're probably, you have sampling error. Well, you can do a lot about that. Take a larger data set in which you have all 500 houses, and then take all the possible pairs of 10 that you can draw from that and calculate a Gini coefficient for those pairs. And do that for every possible pair. That's a very large number of pairs, by the way. And then you have a distribution of estimates of the Gini coefficient for the true one, which is the 500. Well, we found out, there's good news for archaeologists here, which is even 10 observations is enough to give you a very accurate estimate of the Gini coefficient, as long as the houses, or whatever it is, graves or whatever it is, that were not found are random. So the sampling error doesn't give you a really big problem. These are precise in the sense that they're unbiased, and the standard errors are really small. It's a different story when it comes to taking data on, say, burials and combining it with data on housing, and then combining that with data on land or storage. Because there we have to have comparisons across these forms of wealth, because we don't have any unit with which to add up. Say 1 unit of grave wealth is worth 10 units of housing square meters and so on. But we do the same thing. We adjust for the wealth holding units. In some cases we have individuals, in some cases we have families or households. We want to use a benchmark of households, so what we do is we take data sets in which we have the individuals, and then we try to figure out what that might give us if they were actually in households. And we do the same for questions of many data sets. Don't include those without wealth. I mean, if you calculate a Gini coefficient for land, but you include the people without land, you're going to get the wrong number. And the same is true for many other things that we do. So the zeros are missing. We have to estimate the zeros, and we've devised ways, which were actually remarkably accurate, just algorithms for actually putting the zeros back in when you don't have them. Same thing for comparing assets, types, and so on, houses, population size, and so on. So what we do then is all of these distributions here are used in generating our final estimate. So if we want an estimate, for Arcadia, we're going to take an estimate from the raw data, and then we're going to adjust it by a draw from each of these distributions, do the necessary adjustments, and then we end up with the final estimate, which is the one you see in pink. I think I'll just go over that. Then what we do when we compare, say, something we're interested in, in this case, suppose we're comparing hunter-gatherers with early farmers. We just compare the distributions. We take a very large number of draws from the distributions of the hunter-gatherers and of the early farmers, and this is just an example of one of the comparisons, which will surprise some people, probably not many people in this room, but early farmers were not different in terms of their degree of wealth inequality from hunter-gatherers. We're talking about sedentary hunter-gatherers, not foragers. Okay, moving on. I've already explained what I mean by Darwinian. I mean, well, I'll explain what I mean. The replication of inequality, not its origin, is the key idea here. And this is why I think David Wenger and I don't really disagree about the question. They begin their book referring to extraordinary burials, opulent burials. And they comment almost immediately, yes, but these were very rare. We've already seen that extraordinary wealth inequality is not only rare, it's completely absent in our data set. Now, I mean, we would have loved to have found, I mean, there's some sites which we really, really wish we had data on because we really think there's probably a lot of inequality there, but we don't have it. The places where we think there's a lot of inequality seem to be associated with very unusual ecological or physical circumstances, like the advent of bronze in Thailand, or like a salt deposit in Varna. So what we think is the key to understanding observed wealth inequality is not understanding how it originated. Self-aggrandizing people are always there. There are always going to be people trying to get more than other people, and sometimes they'll succeed. The question is, do they succeed and their grandchildren and so on? I showed you the picture. Well, there it is, the picture of a grave. Why don't we have a grave of this person's grandchildren? We don't. It's not there. What happened to it? What happened to them? We don't know, but it wasn't persistent, apparently. And you don't find graves anything like that on the Russian plain over the next 2,000 or 3,000 years. So the idea is to explain replication, not origin. And that's, I think, David, where we may be on the same page a little bit, because I don't think, I think what you do in your book is you observe that there were cases of really severe inequality, and to say that we had a past where inequality was absent is just wrong. It was present, but what I'm saying, it was rare and ephemeral. Now, maybe we disagree about that, I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll continue on and to help continue this conversation. So I use a model, and this is basically a model. The arrows mean causes, and as usual in these diagrams, start on the left. Wealth shocks, that is positive or negative random changes in your wealth, and the intergenerational transmission of wealth. Those are two things which contribute to wealth inequality in a dynamic model. And that then goes on, and that contributes in the end to the far right, inequality in well-being. What I'm talking about here is just the circled stuff. That's as far as we'll get today. And I will use a model like this. What's at the top over there on the right is just a cutout of the previous model. The new stuff in the graph over there is a depiction of a model of stationary wealth inequality. That means long-run equilibrium wealth inequality. Mu is the long-run, mu is inequality. And as you can see on the x-axis, we have that's in t-1, and the vertical axis is in the next year. The solid line says, whatever value you have for wealth on the x-axis, the solid line gives you the wealth that you'll have in the next year. And that's based on to what extent wealth is transmitted over time. That the intersection of those lines, those of you who haven't studied models like this will not be able to retrace these steps or explain it to your friend, but basically the idea is that we're looking at the level of inequality which is self-sustaining under a certain set of institutions and ecology and so on. And the take-home message here is surprising, which is that stationary inequality, that's long-run equilibrium inequality, it's the result of just two things in this model. One is the extent to which wealth is transmitted over time, and the other is the magnitude of the random shocks that happen to a person's wealth. And That's just summarizing that. So, obviously, we would like to... did you have a question, Margaret? I know Margaret's face so well. She was wrinkling up her nose. She did have a question. She said, really? Okay. So we should study the transmission of economic success over time. For example, we should look at something like this, which is on the horizontal we have maternal social status, and the vertical we have daughter social status. These are the kinds of data that we use to estimate that beta, which is the degree of intergenerational wealth transmission. Now, unfortunately, we can't use those data because those are actually data on spotted hyenas. So we have to actually do some hard work with looking at actual wills, the stuff which is actually passed on. Again, this team at SFI has spent years, I can even say decades, collecting data on exactly that. For example, the hunting ability of the dad and the hunting ability of the son, or gathering ability of the mothers and the daughters and so on. That's a form of wealth. That's human wealth, right? Or the cows and so on. And we've done this for a very large number of studies. Now, keep in mind, what beta is how transmitted across generations is wealth. And that's going to jack up the stationary distribution of wealth. Okay, here's some values of beta. Hunting ability, social networks, reproductive success, grip strength, just forearm strength, we measure that. And those numbers, if you look at them, are pretty small. The Aceh hunter there on the left, those are all data from hunting and gathering societies. And what's interesting is what really matters for having a good standard of living as in a hunting and gathering society is just not passed on from parents to kids very much. We couldn't find anything that really is passed on. But if you look at land, and now I'm looking at the right-hand picture there, you get some pretty substantial estimates of beta. So the take-home message here is that the inheritance of material wealth is much greater than for capacities and networks or human stuff which is embodied in us. Okay, that's a fair amount of warming up just before I even get to the story, but I think I now have given you some tools for understanding the story as it unfolds. This is a question, why did substantial enduring wealth inequality not emerge until at least 5 millennia after farming? Now, again, I don't think that's really a big question anymore, but it used to be that people thought that when you got farming, you got inequality. And there's still people who think that, but at least in Western Eurasia, it's just not true. You saw the picture. By the way, in the picture, farming started right about at the earliest data in the picture. Amy's recent work on a couple of the sites in the left-hand side of that graph suggests that they weren't quite farmers yet, but farming came in somewhere along the left-hand side of that picture. So you've got 5 millennia at least before that thing jumps up. Well, I've mentioned Ian Hodder's term. That is, he also talked about fierce egalitarianism. That's describing the site that Amy worked in Anatolia. Christopher Bohm, the anthropologist, refers to, he's referring to farmers. Most of his work is on hunter-gatherers, but he refers to early farmers and says their egalitarianism, like that of hunters, is the product of constant vigilance and sometimes harsh sanctioning. So Bohm thinks of equality as something which is deliberately fought for. It isn't just by default. They didn't figure out how to have an unequal society. Of course, there is always going to be people trying to have more, and the people fight against it. Ian Kite is a wonderful archaeologist working on similar things. I won't repeat what he says there, but he's using data primarily on burials and burial methods. It's what are called secondary burials, to say something about the early period, just before the data which I showed you starts and a bit after. There's also evidence in some cases, including in Çatalhöyük, the place where Amy studied, and others, the possibility that homes were deliberately burned, and the ones we're talking about were the richest homes. And very good evidence that sometimes the means of production, like large grinding stones, were destroyed. Now, this is the deliberate prevention of things being passed from one generation to the next. And by the way, these grinding stones were very hard to destroy. The people made a big effort, and they destroyed ones which were almost new. So the idea is, think about that period as a period in which people were defending an egalitarian society, and they had an egalitarian culture which allowed them and motivated them to do that. That's, I think, a good hypothesis. I thought that one thing I could bring to this, because I know how to do it, is I would model societies interacting in that environment and see how an egalitarian society would look if it occasionally was allowed excursions to a more inegalitarian outcome. So, using a model which I've used frequently to study the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, I modeled what I showed you before. But I was so encouraged recently to read a recent paper by David. If you read the stuff in blue there, he's talking about the Upper Nile. The real puzzle of Nubia's ancient history and archaeology is how its population managed to prevent the emergence of similar pharaonic forms of domination in their midst, despite the existence of Egyptian models of governance on their doorstep. So it's, how did they manage to avoid it? And he has a wonderful story about how if the Nile Valley is wide enough, you could actually move away. And there was a culture of cosmopolitanism, not their word, but openness, which allowed people actually to escape the domination which they might have experienced, much like some people in the eastern United States moved west if wages were pushed down too low in the 19th century. The graph that you see is the Gini coefficient that I calculated in a simulation. And as you can see, and I was surprised at this, okay, the average is really low, but it does have occasional excursions. And those excursions are basically when the bad guys take over. There's an aggressive form of an aggressive type in these models, and they take over. And when they take over, they very seldom are displaced by their own people, but the groups which they've taken over then often lose in conflicts with other groups. And so the last thing I'll show here is the distribution of Gini coefficients. The blue is the simulations that I generated. And that's just pure, that's not data, that's just a simulation using parameters that work pretty well for the period. And the red stuff is the archaeological data. The only point from that is these are highly egalitarian societies that sometimes produce very unequal outcomes. That is the Gini coefficients over on the right. Okay, robots. The same question, and we introduced now a new technology. And I think I'll be interested, Simon Johnson, what you think about this. I mean, basically, this is the idea. That the Ox team had the same role that robots have today, or may have today. And it's a long story to develop, so let me give you the summary. This is a set of ideas that Amy and I and Mattia worked out together, as well as others. But here it is. The appearance of substantial inequality doesn't have to do with the production of food per se, or with the development of surpluses. Surpluses is usually the thing which is associated is the cause of inequality. But instead, it's the transformation of farming from what used to be a labor-limited economy, in which labor was the main resource, to a land-limited economy. By land-limited, I already said, I mean land, oxen, and also enslaved labor. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because, as you've already seen, the things like skills or strength cannot be inherited over time, or not very much. And they're not very equal. They're not very unequal. Remember, the Kipsigis Gini coefficient was something really minor. We're really pretty much... That's what I told my mom. In Wendy's story, I hadn't thought about that. When I said to my mom, we're pretty much all the same. I'm very average. How come they're so poor? You know, that's really the point of this lecture. I hadn't thought about that until just now. That is, the differences amongst us are not very great. So a society in which our labor is the main thing is not going to be very unequal. It's very hard to make it unequal and make it stick. Once you get something you can own and inherit, remember that's beta, the transmission over time, then it makes a big difference. Okay, so we need to have a way of characterizing technologies. And again, I'll be interested, Simon, if you think this might have some bearing on the kind of work that you're doing. Look at that triangle. It's called a simplex. That's a way of representing a technology. And first, there are three kinds of wealth. One is material wealth, the stuff I already mentioned. Another is network wealth, roughly who you know. And then there is embodied wealth. That's all the stuff in you, your health, strength, and so on. I will call some embodied wealth. Another name for that among anthropologists is, it's also called somatic wealth. Any point in that triangle represents a combination of the three. So for example, point D, which is pretty close to network, means the networks are really important. It's pretty far away from material, so it means that material is not very important, and so on. So a simple way to see this is a point which is close to a vertex indicates the technology in which the thing at the vertex is important. Well, again, with my team at SFI, we went out and measured that for a whole bunch of societies. Now, this is a particular data set from hunter-gatherers, horticultural which means non-plow farming, pastoral and agricultural. And again, we have network, material, and embodied. It's the same picture. And just remember, if it's close to a vertex, that's the thing that matters. So if you see the squares and the diamonds, that's pastoral and agricultural, and that's material. But if you look at the horticultural and hunter-gatherer, that's way over towards the edge of networks and embodied. In fact, it's amazing that you can draw a line through the graph that partitions them entirely. So there's one group, which is hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists. And by the way, the big news here is horticulturalists are not very different from hunter-gatherers when it comes to inequality. I mean, try to find some difference. They're not very different when it comes to Gini coefficients or inheritance of wealth or anything. And so early farming probably wasn't all that different. And that's what we're trying to explain. In any case, what this says is, yes, we do have big differences between the technologies. And what we found, and I'll show you two pieces of evidence, is that where material wealth is important, wealth inequality is greater. So that's the top graph. Mu is how important it is, and the vertical is the Gini. And those are all observations we have from our small-scale societies project. And below, we have, from the work that Amy and Mattia and I did, we differentiate societies into land-limited or labor-limited. The labor-limited are the pink, and the land-limited are the blue. And you can see substantial differences in the means of the Gini coefficient. The horizontal axis is the level of the Gini coefficient. The blue being to the right of the pink means that the land-limited places are more unequal. And I hope Amy will talk a little bit about how we know, or how we think we know. Okay. We invented the term archaic proto-state because the early states, we think, concentrated power but did not monopolize it. And it's surprising to me that there are a whole bunch of developments in Mesopotamia which are called the origin of states, and they have nothing to do with the Weberian state, which is based on the monopoly of the use of force. I think better would be Weber's idea of the patrimonial state, which is based on, it's not enforced by coercion, but is essentially, it's a very large household with very extensive powers based on a lineage and not based on a bureaucracy. Now, again, I don't want to, this guy, Igor Diakonov, was a fantastic Soviet archaeologist and historian who wrote a wonderful book about early states in Mesopotamia. I think his work has been very much validated recently. And a summary is that they're neither autocratic, despotic, nor unlimited power. They didn't exercise military functions autonomously. And but they couldn't really be considered to be democratic, at least not in a modern liberal democratic sense. I won't say much about slavery because I've already said it. The ownership of labor can make even a labor-intensive crop like cotton into the basis of a material wealth limited economy, because the labor itself becomes just like the land and just like the oxen and so on. And I say that with a deep distress to think of enslaved people having the same status in this model as something which can be inherited like an ox and so on, but that is the way the institution worked. So when you put all this together, there's a lot of information here. The Gini coefficient is on the x-axis. What we have there is 4 distributions, that the bar graphs, they're colored, and on this you see on the left. So what really makes a difference here? Well, the big thing you notice is the red stuff on the left. Those are the labor-limited places which don't have states. If you if you look at the green, the land-limited places that don't have states, they're a little farther to the right. They have a distribution which is a little more unequal. When you get land-limited and states, you get the blue or whatever that color is farther to the right. And then distinctively more unequal are the states, the proper states with slavery, which are really unequal. Can a similar interpretation be extended beyond Western Eurasia? There are a lot of people in the room who could do that better than me, and I've already mentioned Amy. I'm sure there are others. What can we say about the future? Well, think about what's called, by Danny Qua, he called it the knowledge-based weightless economy. The weightless economy is weightless because the stuff that's being transacted can't be packaged, weighed, and so on, and measured, and therefore it cannot be written into a contract. That's the key idea of the weightless economy. If you think of labor itself, can we contract for labor? Well, it's always hard to contract for labor because it's never very obvious what it is the person is supposed to do. The areas of the economy which is relatively easier, because there's a physical commodity being produced, farming, agriculture, and manufacturing, in the US it's 1 in 7 people. The modern economy today is not producing things. It's producing effects, culture, knowledge, and so on, but it's not producing things. And so modern information processing, including surveillance technology, are permitting more complete contracts. I mean, think of the gig economy. So some of this, you're making labor more subject to complete contracts because you can surveil them better. You know if the package was delivered and so on. So there's a little bit of a retrogression towards like a putting out system in which people are doing tasks which actually can be now bought and paid for instead of their time. But there are also offsetting forces. There's, of course, massive shift into caring, educational, security, knowledge, production and distribution, and so on, which will be somewhat resistant to AI and robotization. And moreover, a point that Wendy and I made as a conjecture in a paper, notice that AI and automation requires that you can write an algorithm for something to be done, or you can at least evaluate whether a good job has been done by this whatever it is that you're using, this mechanism. If that's possible, then it's also likely that the jobs that are being replaced by that technology will be the ones for which the contracts were relatively complete. Because if you can write an algorithm to do it, you can also write a contract to see if it got done. That's not exactly true, but what I suggest is this technology is going to leave us with an economy in which we have unusually difficult to monitor and measure labor as its main task. Kenneth Arrow, a very long time ago, half a century ago, wrote, "Information is a fugitive resource." And I love that. You see the hunters there. They're hunting a fugitive animal. I was actually hunting with them that day. And we didn't catch anything. Those of you who are Buddhist in this room, don't worry. We didn't catch anything. Information is a fugitive resource. We're just beginning to face the contradictions between the systems of private property and of information acquisition and dissemination, an increasing tension between legal relations and fundamental economic determinants. Some of you know that he's paraphrasing Marx. That is exactly a paraphrase of Marx's ideas about how technology will eventually make anachronistic a set of rules of the game that have to be replaced. And that's Kenneth Arrow. Now, here's a hypothesis. We moved from point A in that simplex, hunting and gathering and horticulture, over towards the material side of the simplex. And that was the move from the labor-limited to the land-limited economy. And are we moving back towards a more labor-limited economy? Here's a passage from, skip this. I'll just quote Thomas Jefferson. Fantastic letter that he wrote in 1813. That's not Jefferson. I'm defining a public good, non-rival and excludable. Here's Jefferson. An idea, its particular character, is that no one possesses the less because each of us possesses the whole of it. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction in himself without lessening mine. He who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. And it's non-rival. This is still Jefferson. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction in himself without lessening mine. Ideas are incapable of confinement. Remember Arrow. Information is a fugitive resource. Incapable of refinement or exclusive appropriation. Inventions then cannot be in nature subject to property. Well, much of what we depended on for most of the period of biologically modern humans was essentially hunting things like kudus. And just for reference, I think that kudu there has something like 340,000 edible calories. Now think about, by the way, they were hunted by 2 or 3 people, not by large groups. So think of the 2 or 3 people who actually captured that kudu. What are they going to do with this thing? Are they going to eat it all? No, they can't. No fridge, right? So they might as well share it. That is, the cost to them of sharing it is 0. But also, the likelihood that those 3 people would actually get anything is really rare. I mean, something among the Hadza people, for example, which have been well studied, maybe 3% chance. Every time you go out, maybe 3 in 100 you're going to actually get anything, like when I went hunting with the Hadza people. So there's 2 things. What you're eating is a public good, and what you require is massive insurance in order for you to be able to do that. Otherwise, you just go hunt something that you're more likely to get, which doesn't have such a high yield. Okay, the rest is pictures. Oh, 0. Okay, no words. We started off as some kind of hierarchical ape. And so we became an egalitarian one because we were hunters. We changed to a land-limited economy, which became industrial and continued to be material wealth limited. And we're now moving to the World Wide Web. And the question is, what does that mean? Well, here's some possibilities. Again, we start with the kudu and we domesticate animals, in this case cows, turn them into plow drawers. And then do we essentially go the route of Jefferson, recognizing the public goods nature of most of what counts in a modern economy and not allowing it to be private property? Or does the robotization of work make working people so abundant that their political power has been reduced to such an extent that they, like the early farmers, are eventually subjected to modern levels of wealth inequality? So let me end with this. The Tandroi in Madagascar are herders, as you can see. And you already saw the Kipsigis had a highly unequal distribution of cows. And you might think that would be true among the Kipsigis. But they have a funeral practice, some of you may have heard about this, in which at the time of the death of a wealthy herder among the Tandroi, they have a huge feast. And I'll ask you 2 questions. The first one is kind of obvious. What do you think they eat at the feast? They eat from the herd of the deceased. And how long does it go on? I know, you're thinking, no, it can't be. In some cases, it goes on until the herd has been eliminated. Okay, that's 100% wealth tax. And by the way, there's a nice wrinkle, which is the immediate family of the deceased cannot eat the meat of the deceased. I mean, they're taken care of. But I mean, this is a radical form of wealth redistribution, which this society has hit upon as a way of rebooting in every generation so that that beta thing, which is the transition of wealth, doesn't allow the wealth to accumulate generation after generation. Now, if you think of modern societies, we say, yeah, but we're not the Tandroi and we're not hunter-gatherers. Well, what about Denmark? In Denmark, intergenerational transmission of wage earning capacity is about the same as among hunter-gatherers. So Denmark has achieved the level of equality in terms of that dimension of what are thought to be the most egalitarian societies in the world. What differentiates the UK, US, Italy, which have very, very high levels of beta intergenerational transmission, is policy, institutions. So the take-home is that, to put it in colloquial terms, inequality is not like the weather. It just doesn't happen. It's made by people who benefit from it. And so the Tandroi have a message to us. It's yours to decide. Thanks.